So thank you again for coming. I can see it's a hardcore audience here on the evening, particularly when we have competing priorities at the BIC, which seems to be happening at an increasing pace, which is good for the BIC, but occasionally not great for each individual session. But thank you again for coming. The other advantage of a cozy audience is that we can get more quickly into a much more involved Q&A. And so I will cut it a little short and allow ourselves a little bit more time to discuss not only the contents and the context of Aditya's book, but also what it might imply for the India of today. I'm particularly delighted to be in conversation with Aditya today for a couple of reasons. First, I think the story that he tells here remains undertold, if not untold, in India. And so it's very important to surface and resurface a lot of the ideas that he brings out in the book. That's number one. Number two, I think the book, as you will see, for those of you who have just got it now, or as you listen to the talk, is really a masterpiece in how to do scholarly research. So at least some part of my questions and perhaps some of yours will be not merely what the info in the book is, but also how you go about corroborating and establishing veracity and then documenting whatever it is that you wish to say. So I think there's a making of the book part of this that I think is going to come out to be very relevant, that I would encourage you to ask questions towards the end on. I won't dwell on the bio of Aditya. You can read it, but since you're all fans of history, I'm going to draw two threads. The first one I would say, of course, is that it's very encouraging that in the strand of Ram Guha and Srinath Raghavan and several of our new book-writing Indian contemporary historians, we can have a very young and energetic and superbly scholarly young man join that crowd. So if you hadn't heard it before, you're seeing the new wave come up right in front of you. So that's very encouraging. Two threads that I'd like to draw from Aditya's resume blurb. The first is he's a Marshall scholar. This is the same Marshall that all of you know from the Marshall Plan. But among other things, George C. Marshall, as he was at that time, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, but before that, I think chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the U.S. through the entire World War. So he had a very sterling career, and he set up the scholarship after his passing, and that is awarded to promising young students in the U.S.-UK corridor, and Aditya is one of them. The other is that his dissertation won the prize. Again, this is because all of you are history students, from Ellen MacArthur. Any guesses at all as to who Ellen MacArthur is? Okay, I'm going to say it, and you please correct me if I'm wrong. So Ellen MacArthur, and in particular, particularly with reference to the other session that's going on here in the BIC today, Ellen MacArthur is, at least in my reference, the first woman PhD in UK. She actually got her D.Lit after many years of work because she wouldn't have been allowed to join Cambridge as a student when she went and taught. And she established a prize in economic history, and Aditya is one of the recent winners of the Ellen MacArthur Prize for Economic History out of Cambridge. So am I correct about Ellen MacArthur?
Yes, that's right, as far as I know. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if people know the long history of Cambridge. Just 1 minute detour before we get into the Swatantra Party. And I was surprised to learn this myself, that women could only officially be granted a degree in Cambridge in 1948. Right? So just think about it, that in the context of Indian history, the largest, poorest country to be born with women's ability to vote was a few years culminating in 1947, prior to people being able to go to get a university degree in Cambridge. So lots has happened in 80 years, but just useful to keep that particular thing in context. I just thought I'd take away from the usual sort of bio, which you can read. Aditya is extremely well qualified, having grown up in DC and Istanbul, and went to both Cambridges. So Cambridge on the Boston side and Cambridge in the UK side, and then comes to us via this book. So welcome, Aditya.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank the folks at the BIC for having me, Sandhya, Ravi, and to thank Narayan for agreeing to moderate this. And we did have a chance to talk a little bit about the session, how the session would go. And it was quite evident that he had read the book extremely carefully, which as an author is the best thing that you can hope for. So thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start with a softball. Tell us what your book is about.
Sure. So it's not actually a softball because you have there are many things that you think the book is about, but you have to give a reasonably concise answer, right? So this is basically a history of economic ideas and politics. And what do I mean by that? Well, it kind of explains how an alternative set of ideas, right, and projects to planned economic development emerged, organized around the idea of, or the key word of what was called free economy, right, countered to socialist planned economy, right? That was how it's rhetorically set up, right? And it's about how these ideas and later associated practices are expressed in a variety of genres, right? Everything from children's books to newspaper articles to magazines to kind of slogans that are chanted on the streets, right? And then how those ideas then become the platform of an opposition party that is called the Swatantra or Freedom Party. It is about how these ideas of free economy are translated and reworked when we get to electoral politics, right? And then it is about what I call opposition politics, right? And there are three dimensions of opposition politics, right? So Tantra is not the only opposition party at the time. But what is significant is, one, in terms of imagination, right? The point that C. Rajgopalachari, who's one of the founders of the party, has this idea that you need a conservative party, right, to balance the excesses of or provide a check on the power of a progressive, umbrella dominant party, right, and that kind of will give you a balance in democracy. So even if the aims and aspirations of the democracy is progressive, it can even help to push you toward those ends, right, by being a kind of check on abuses and excessive, and help from pushing that society toward authoritarianism, which you see happen in post-colonial societies across the world, right? So that's kind of part A or plank A of opposition politics. Part B is about bringing economic discourse, right, into public debate and contestation, right, in a variety of genres, and about trying to move it away from the, I suppose, the domain of pure expertise, right? This was a time when the Nehruvian state was trying to produce a kind of technocratic idea of economic development, sort of scientific, and this is something that the people who get behind Swatantra will have nothing of, right? For them, this is a deeply political, economics is a deeply political thing, right? And in the process of communicating economic ideas, they're also trying to seek to educate the populace, right? And then part 3 of opposition politics, right, is to try to use the institutions of India's democracy, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, or legislative and the judiciary especially, to try to put a check on the executive. Now, how do they do that? Well, they do things like forming mergers and coalitions. They do things like producing no-confidence motions. They do things like trying to amplify their ideas about the right to property by bringing cases to the Supreme Court, including some of the most famous cases of the 1960s and 70s. So that's really what the book is broadly about, but I could always, of course, go on.
So I'll supply the editorial only because he's so deep in the subject that I might occasionally want to just pull us out of it and then pull us out of it so that... So to put it in context, again, all of you will recall there are sort of 4 threads of politics and economics in India, pre-independence, post-independence, sort of the period that this covers, broadly speaking, from 1920 to say 1975, but if you want to narrow it further, 30 to 70 or something like that. So one thread is, of course, the Congress thread that we all know about, starting with, A.O. Hume and Annie Besant and all of those good things. And We are very well versed in that because the history of it has been told in many ways, many times. The second thread, which obviously given the change in establishment in 2014, was the one born in Nagpur in 1925, and we have since heard a fair bit about that. So those are the two major threads. The two threads, one of which is being discussed here and one of which is not being discussed here, is the communist thread, right? Not widely written about, and how universalist, for instance, an Indian was involved in setting up the Mexico Communist Party in a big way, and so on. That thread is not widely written about, and actually, in my view, deserves much more research and discussion than it deserves, and that has not yet come out. And then the fourth thread is this thread of the Swatantra Party, and broadly speaking, and we'll get into it in a little while, the discussion of the economic right as a political plank for opposition, right? So that's the thing that, the exposition that Aditya is really has begun in this book, and I think deserves the kind of scholarly and deep-rooted research attention that he has given it. So I'm going to sort of dovetail into the very first question. So situate for us this ideological conservatism, both the economic conservatism and maybe to some extent even sort of what I would call Burkean conservatism, and how it came to be the opposition against various forms of, you call it Nehruvian progressivism, but all the progressive discussions that we had in the early 40s to late 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important, just before I get into that, to say that even the other key party of the right at this time, which is the Bharatiya Janasangh, their economic platform is not very well developed, as I've written about elsewhere, but it is, at least rhetorically, they're saying that they're okay with some form of socialism. So they're not actually making this claim that Swatantra Party is making, and that's why I think it's particularly distinctive, and which is why I would sort of defend my choice of the term conservatism, right? There are some people who would say, well, if you were to classify a party that is interested in kind of freer markets and this sort of thing, that's actually a very radical thing for the India of the 1960s. But if we're thinking about it relationally, right, and this gets to the heart of the definition of conservative, right? If everybody else is promising socialism or communism, and you're promising something that is broadly, let's say, liberal, relationally it is a conservative thing, even though on the absolute, right, basis, it may be something else. So sort of your political theorist would differ with your historian in terms of classifying this. But to come back to the meaning of conservatism, right, what does it mean? Conservatism is always something that is conservative relative to what? It is contextually rooted and specific, right? And I think that goes to, even if we look at the classic conservative that is Burke, that is something that, comes up in his writings, right? In terms of the economic conservatism of the Swatantra Party relative to what's happening in the day, I would say that it is animated by positive and negative visions. So negative visions of what they call economic freedom and positive projects. I would say that the key kind of negative critique, right, sort of freedom from, is freedom from the what C. Rajgopalachari calls the permit license quota Raj. What is the permit license quota Raj? Well, today we tend to call the permit license quota Raj everything that we don't like about the Indian economy, right? Or everything that has vestiges of pre-1991. But actually, so there is certainly a dimension of that. But in the time that it is coined, right, permit license quota Raj is very specific, and it's about the oligarchic coalition between Congress party politicians, right, big businesses. And so it's commonly, common misconception about Swatantra as just a party of big business and Maharajas. It's actually, there's more big business support for the Congress at this time than there is for the Swatantra Party. So big business, politicians, and bureaucrats who distribute the permits and licenses of the planned economy, which, as you find out from your reports in the 60s, are actually overwhelmingly going to your bigger business houses. So it's about how that oligarchic coalition, right, how that oligarchic coalition hollows out the substantive content of democracy, and the political masterstroke is to say that this is a new Raj, that you have independence from the British Raj, but you're now in the license Raj of the Congress. So that's the negative point. Then there are various positive visions, and we can kind of discuss them in greater detail. And these vary. right? So there's everything from India as a free trading nation in a global order to a cooperative style. A set of cooperatives producing milk in the Charotar tract of Gujarat, which is now known as Amul, right? That is run by private philanthropy and private property rather than through the other forms of cooperative development that are being pursued by the Indian state. And then there are also various ideas about how to coordinate global prices for agricultural nations so that they are not exposed to the vicissitudes of global markets, which may strike you as something that's not particularly kind of free market. But it's an interesting kind of conversation to have. But what kind of links these, I suppose, visions of free economy as part of this economic conservatism are 4 points, right? The first is a kind of anti-communism, right? The second is a sort of decentralized development relative to, sitting in Delhi and kind of planning for the nation centrally, indicative planning, this sort of thing that's taking place, right? A third point is unfettered kind of private sector activity, right? So not being encumbered by having to deal with bureaucrats, grease palms, etc. And then the fourth is a kind of anti-communism. And by that, I don't just mean against the Communist Party, right? Particularly after 1959, when Nehru dismisses the invokes Article 356 to dismiss the Kerala government. Communism is not so much something that people are worried about from the Communist Party. The concern is greater that, and it's something that you see across Cold War thought is today they nationalize the airline industry, tomorrow they're coming for your heads. And that, in the context, what seems alarmist to us today, in the context of what is taking place in the Soviet Union and in the FSU kind of, I guess what we would now call former Soviet Union countries, that is something that is actually quite significant, and it kind of assumes a more kind of amplified and realistic tone.
Yeah, and just hang on to some of these threads because a lot of these are relevant even today, right? We don't see it, but the insidious practice of socialism and getting rid of market structures and pricing and others in the greater good for inclusivity and so on is happening today widely because more people get this and more people get that. But in that process, we are actually obviating need for market pricing and market structures. And so a lot of what is being talked about as a 1950s anti-Nehruvian plank might still be valid today, even though the characters and the times have moved on quite a bit. So just hold on to the thought. We'll talk a little bit more. So let's go to a sort of an emotional thing that you lay out very nicely in one of your chapters. And this is this story that became sort of emblematic of that time, which is Ek Gadhe Ki Atmakatha, which is the autobiography of an ass. And maybe you can lead this proverbial ass down Janpat, or no, not Janpat, Shantipat, or whatever the term is in Delhi, and tell us what the ass encountered. So this is a brilliant story about how the ass goes from department to department and then ends up
at Nehru, who's very excited and wants to take a ride on the ass, right? And of course, what does that make Nehru, right? So broadly, where does this come from? So this is a story of a donkey that is employed by a washerman, and the washerman dies or something like that, and he basically is looking for compensation from the government to get some kind of alimony or whatever from the widow. It's a whatever government-employed washerman or something of that sort of fantastical. And then every place that this donkey goes, he's being referred to another department, another person, another superior. So he says finally he goes to Nehru. And at some point, there is a merchant who sees him on Nehru and believes that, wow, this guy is really well connected. I should give my daughter in marriage to this donkey. Because then it will help me get some trade licenses more preferentially. Okay, so broadly, this current of cynicism is also exemplified in another story called Rag Darbari, which actually takes place in rural India by this IAS officer called Srilal Shukla, right? And it's about kind of development gone awry. And so they give you both a rural and an urban perspective on this, and that is emblematic of a current of disillusionment that you see in the print public sphere across Indian languages all over the country, right? And in a way, one of the metaphors for this is, Girish Karnad's Tughlaq as well, about a very able leader who comes into, who befall all kinds of calamities. And there is a kind of structural foundation for this in that by the late 1950s, early 1960s, India is facing food and foreign exchange shortages, right? The plans are in trouble. Once, I think there's a memorable line by I.G. Patel in his memoirs, by 1960, planning kind of is never quite able to catch its breath again. Right, and the power moves from the Planning Commission to the Finance Ministry, right? And so it is at that point, you also start to see pressure from foreign interests in terms of trying to manage, pressure to liberalize and, to decontrol imports. And that's something that the sort of autonomy, in some senses, to direct your model of development is perceived by some as having been lost, right? But at a micro level, right, people are also starting to experience from the 50s more bureaucracy, people who are more powerful, experiencing commodity controls, right, more extraction by the state, which is starting to raise certain kinds of taxes, particularly indirect taxes, right? Most people don't pay direct taxes. And so you get the interplay of interests, which are your newly powerful bureaucrats, right, and your professionals who are increasingly kind of moving to the cities, working in different forms of employment. And you have these, even though they're not the focus of the plans, small businesses are actually, being able to form and growing at 7 to 8% a year, but they're encountering and feeling encumbered by some of the regulations of the state. So while all that is going on, you start to see in the literary sphere manifestations of this disillusionment in, brilliant pieces of satire like this.
So I'm going to encourage the young startups in the room to wear their VR glasses and get the grandchild of this ass to walk down South Block today and see what they encounter, right? So the reason why all of this history is relevant is if it doesn't actually repeat itself, it's rhyming in many, many ways today, and as it has throughout the history of India. Now, certain aspects of the openness might have changed quite dramatically, particularly after 1991, but the nature of power and the oligopoly and the oligarchy in various other contexts remains quite similar to what it has been at various points in post-independence history. So the ass might encounter change, but not change. So I'm going to ask a question. What does the name Lotwala mean to any of you? Have you heard the name? Oh, you okay.
Thank you, Akash.
Thank you. Aditya is now going to explain how a lot of us have heard about Swatantra Party. Some may have heard, we already all have heard of Rajaji. We may or may not have heard of some of the smaller characters in Swatantra, which we will get to shortly. But before that, it's super important to understand almost the foreword to the Swatantra Party, and the foreword to the Swatantra Party and sort of the right of center economic-based opposition in India starts with the Lotwala family.
So interestingly, the story begins in my book at the intersection of Vittalbhai and Vallabhbhai Patel roads in Bombay, where you have a library which continues in existence today called the RL Foundation Library. Now, if you could actually go into that library and work there if you wanted, there are a number of civil service aspirants who make it their daily home. And there you see a bookshelf there, a dusty bookshelf that says Libertarian Co-op Bookstore, and there's a portrait of founder Ranchod Das Lotwala. Now, if you think of Ranchod Das, many of you think of the protagonists of Three Idiots also, probably, right? Which is the pen name, or not the real name, of Amir Khan in the film. The Lotwala family, right? And actually, we are talking about Kusum Lotwala and Ranchod Das Lotwala. Kusum Lotwala is the daughter of Ranchod Das Lotwala. Are probably, I would say the most, ideologically, the most significant family in Indian history that you haven't heard of. And the reason is as follows. The Lotwalas are both key patrons, or especially Ranchod Das is a key patron of Marxism in India, and later becomes a key patron of what he calls Indian libertarianism, which gives rise in many ways ideologically to the Swatantra Party. How does he get how does he get from point A to point B? To quote why this Colaverity, what a changeover, right? So if you were to think about this, he's essentially a mill owner, right? From a Halai Lohana caste which is a Gujarati family, but they migrated to Mumbai about 200, 300 years, before he's born. And he essentially is responsible for mechanizing that process, and from the profits that he makes supplying to the army bakeries in World War I, he makes a lot of money. And then starts to patronize various different kinds of political causes, including sponsoring S.A. Dange's study of Marxism and bringing out the first socialist weekly in India in the 1920s, I believe, and publishing the first Indian edition of the Communist Manifesto. Okay, so basically what is he doing? He is trying to push any ideology that is anti-imperial, right, across the spectrum. But then what happens? Well, one thing that happens is during the Meerut conspiracy, his house is invaded and searched, and not all mill owners are like Engels, so they don't necessarily feel like sticking to their Marxism. A second thing that happens is the split in the international left between the Trotskyists and the Stalinists, right? And the sort of Trotskyist internationalist strand is kind of wiped out, right? And that creates a lot of disillusionment. And so both of these things kind of push Lotwala in a different direction, right? And he is somebody who is going to London every year. He's importing all the kind of avant-garde radical material. He's kind of financially supporting various types of people. In fact, at one stage, he even meets Periyar in London, okay? And then he kind of comes back and sifts through and sorts through what he's reading and comes every couple of years to a new kind of synthesis. Right? And what he ends up coming to is what he calls a form of libertarianism, right? But by the time he comes to this, he's pretty old, right? His eldest daughter, who is the first woman to be on the Bombay Municipal Council, whose name is Bachuben Lotwala, is a kind of good Gandhian, whereas Lotwala never liked Gandhi's mixture of religion and politics. And his son is, involved in playing as a journalist, and again, not willing to kind of help out. So it is his daughter, Kusum Lotwala, when this man is in his 70s, who takes up the kind of cudgels and tries to make this Lotwala library viable. And what they do is they import texts, libertarian texts, from overseas, including from the Foundation for Economic Education in New York, from American individualist anarchists, from various kinds of anti-communist writers across the Atlantic, and they bring it to India and try to develop, through research of their own, a kind of homegrown ideology of political economy for the country. And they plug themselves into a network of other dissenting organizations that are against Nehruvian planning, Nehruvian ideas about the state-society relationship, etc., etc. And together, they're sort of more than the sum of their parts, and they kind of amplify each other, and they're able to reach wider audiences and catch one very distinguished person who is C. Rajagopalachari.
Do you think, I mean, just a quick aside, do you think Rajagopalachari was independently thinking that way as well, and corroborated with what Lodwalas did, or is there enough evidence to establish that Rajagopalachari was converted by the Lodwalas?
Yeah, so I think Rajagopalachari was always on his own. One can never say that Rajagopalachari has ever fallen into thrall of any one person, including Gandhi. He's very much always an independent person, right? But what I think is useful for Rajagopalachari, right, whose understandings about economic ideas I detail in the book are essentially an economic common sense that are developed from his experience as a lawyer, from his experience of administration, from his readings. In the 50s, when he's trying to reinvent himself as a kind of economics commentator, right, in writing in the magazine Swarajya every week, the people who become useful for him are the Indian libertarians. And so he's able to import that rhetoric into his writings. And then he also comes into conversation with a free market economist named B.R. Shenoy, who serves as a kind of tutor to him during this period. So yes, they are, I would say...
birds of a feather, but...
Yeah, they're birds of a feather, and they provide a sort of scaffolding for Rajagopalachari, who's already pretty well-formed in his ideas by this time.
So I think the one good takeaway for everyone here, including myself when I read the book, was this the role of Kusum Lotwala in particular in catalyzing this entire thought process and almost entire stream of thinking in Indian contemporary history. Aditya uses a very nice phrase in this discussion of the Lotwalas, which I think will appeal to some of you. It says, economically equalitarian, politically libertarian, and socially fraternal, right? Now, I don't know how many of your political persuasions end up that way, but it's certainly a nice phrase, so think about it. I'm going to switch slight tack and draw your attention to the word free economy. I don't know how many of you registered that this is not free markets. So I think it's important to make that distinction and register the difference. And I'm going to ask Aditya to explain what free economy means, and in particular illustrate that with a difference from Friedman and Hayek globally, and from Gandhi and the Ramrajya blokes locally.
Yeah, so absolutely. So like I mentioned, there are those sort of four aspects of free economy, right? This anti-statism, decentralization, the defense of private property, and anti-communism. That's the lowest common denominator behind these kind of ideas of free economy. Now, in the original conception, when Lotwala defines it, see, free economy...
Sorry to interrupt there. But in the libertarian or early writings of Rajaji, K. Munshi probably even more, but no discussion of market surprises.
Yes, exactly. So this is what's important, right? So the point is that it is there's a kind of anarchic thrust to this, right? And I mean a kind of anarcho-libertarian in that respect, in that it is deeply suspicious of the state form. Okay, so that is important. So it is, in a sense, it's not about the state, necessarily the state providing the conditions in the beginning. It's not about the states providing the conditions for business to succeed or for markets to operate in, according to a particular way, right? In the Lotwalan conception, right, the important thing is freedom of occupation. Right? Freedom of occupation, decentralized production, currency that is tethered to the value of labor so that there's not much inflation, right? And in a sense, you can see certain kind of superficial resemblance to the sort of Schumpeterian, entrepreneurs working, and you never have too much of corporate concentration, right? Different entrepreneurs in a kind of free marketplace. Like that's, in some sense, what it means to a figure like Lotwala. In a figure like Rajaji and I guess to an extent Munshi, it is, again, they're not necessarily thinking about mechanisms of exchange and interrelation, right? The whole point about your sort of circular flow and all of that, that's not something that they're very kind of sophisticated about thinking about. Whereas if you were to look at the formal thinkers, right, of your free market economists, they have very sophisticated ideas about those things. Another distinction is these figures are not methodologically individualist, right? That's very substantial. The family is something that continues to be important for somebody like C. Rajgopalachari, right? For a figure like Minu Masani, who's a general secretary of the party, maybe less so. But broadly, family and then the caste basis of accumulation is something that is a part of broadly a number of these free economy projects. The distinction between the Gandhian political economy, right? They have anti-statism and decentralization that is similar. But I would say there are two distinctions. I think the first is that they are far more sympathetic to the use of technology, right? And so even if, a figure like Rajgopalachari comes from a rural or Mofassil background, the embrace of modern technology is not something that he views as an evil, which Gandhi is quite strident about in many of his writings, right? And similarly, there is an attitude towards wealth that is different. Rajgopalachari, unlike Gandhi, doesn't believe in, produce writings in which wealth is kind of questioned as sinful, right? The question for Rajgopalachari is always about excess, right? So that's another kind of crucial distinction between the kind of Swatantra people and the Gandhians as well.
Again, lots of parallels to where we are today, and discussions not only in India but worldwide about excess, what is enough, what is the difference between capitalism and compassionate capitalism, if there is such a term, et cetera, et cetera. So just I think it triggers the juices to think about a lot of these things. Do you think we'll get to the characters in Swatantra in just a minute, and we'll dwell on that for a short while. But before we get there, do you think the Swatantra Party was unambitious because it sort of defined as its ceiling being credible opposition? And this despite the fact that the single largest opposition party in 1967 was the Swatantra Party, with 44 seats. And it was the first time that the Congress actually began to lose its extraordinary majorities that it had gained until that moment. So was there a failure of aggressive imagination, you think, in the Swatantra Party?
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually this is actually to Swatantra's credit, which is I think they have a realistic assessment of, in the India of today, what can we reasonably get, right? So, for example, they managed to form a coalition government in Orissa. It's very sort of brief. They managed to become the official opposition in Gujarat, in Andhra Pradesh, in Rajasthan, and they managed to they fall just short of being the recognized official opposition in the Lok Sabha, right?
67.
Yeah, in 67, yeah. So, one way of thinking about this is, okay, this is a party that is not able to get a large electoral footprint. But if you think about this, when you are looking at the Bharatiya Janasangh, which, okay, it's only founded in 1951, but the RSS, its parent organization, has been going since the 20s, or the communists, which are formed in the interwar period, and Swatantra gets far more seats than those two parties. Yes, it has a number of ex-congressmen in it. In a way, that's a very substantial thing, right? And I think that, so, one might say that, by producing yourself as opposition, that's a kind of impoverished imaginary. But at another level, they're willing to go to some pretty phenomenal lengths to help unseat the Congress in certain states, chief among them being in Tamil Nadu, right, or what becomes Tamil Nadu, where they ally with the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam and they help bring down the Congress, and the Congress has, as Tamils are very happy to say, never came back after that, right? So again, I don't want to draw kind of causality based on Swatantra, but it is a significant but subordinate part of that coalition. If we think about the India of today, I would say that perhaps there may be a larger set of classes that might find the appeal of that kind of an ideology. But I think in the India of the 1960s, it is more limited, right? And so I think that in a manner of speaking, Swatantra actually does electorally quite a creditable job, given its resources and its limitations. And we have to think about, in a global context, the preponderance of an anti-colonial nationalist party that receives the reins of the state after independence. I mean, how many societies are there in which you actually have a viable two-party system 20 years after independence, right? Many of these societies don't continue to be democratically governed after 20 years, right? So.
As famously our neighbor demonstrates. So let's move to the characters of Swatantra itself. And there was certainly a motley group led by Rajagopalachari and Minu Masani, but take us through some of the meaningful characters. There's a wonderful long chapter about all of these guys and the birth of Swatantra. And for those of you who have not read it, very easily accessible on the internet, you should read the manifesto of the Swatantra Party. It's called Manifest? I don't know what it's called, the Manifest.
Well, to prosperity through freedom.
Yeah. And it was written in 57, was it, or 58?
I believe it's written in 59, yeah.
I thought it was written when somebody was waiting for somebody and Rajaji scratched it on the back of an envelope or something like that.
Right, okay. This is so Narayan actually knows a lot about the Swatantra Party as well. So yes,
right, so apparently it was, somebody was late in traffic or something like that, and Rajaji just wrote it on the back of an envelope, and you will actually see how relevant some of those, how timeless some of those comments are. So please look up that if you can. But probably more interesting than the manifesto is going to be the characters themselves. So let's go through and maybe start with Rajaji. Everybody may not know Rajaji himself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and his birth anniversary was a couple of days ago, and his death anniversary is Christmas Day, 25th December 1972, right? And on the occasion, actually, both two leading opposition politicians, Shashi Tharoor and Jairam Ramesh, commented very movingly on Twitter about Rajgopalachari and the way in which they feel his vision is still valuable for today. So I'm not the only one who believes that it's worth kind of looking at Rajgopalachari. So Rajgopalachari is somebody whose major achievement in early life, right, is to essentially bring South India behind Gandhian politics, right? And he becomes Gandhi's right-hand man. Gandhi calls him this conscience keeper. And there's even a kind of marital link in that his daughter marries Devdas Gandhi, who's Gandhi's son, right? But then they kind of fall out over various things, but most prominently in 1942 over the Quit India movement, which Rajgopalachari believes that India should, earn its freedom and support the British war effort, and of course Gandhi has other ideas. And after that, Rajgopalachari is kind of reduced to a sort of shadow of himself in terms of political salience for the Indian nation. Nehru becomes the kind of favored successor, etc., etc. Rajgopalachari also has two important stints, eventful but short stints at the helm of affairs in Madras Presidency and later Madras State. So when Congress contests the elections in 1937, he becomes the Premier of Madras. He is ruthless administrator, very efficient, draws 1/6 the salary, this kind of thing, but also decides to implement as part of the Gandhian constructive program. He tries to bring Hindi learning to schools, and that makes him very unpopular. And the Dravidian movement essentially makes his life quite difficult. And of course, then the Congress kind of resigns the ministries. He comes back in 1952 in the elections when the Congress do not get the kinds of majority that they want, and the communists actually make pretty good inroads. And so he kind of is at the helm of a caretaker government. They ask him to come out of retirement. He does one thing immediately, which is to abolish food controls, which is extremely popular. Even his great rival, who's spent much of the last 15 years criticizing him, Periyar, applauds this as a great step. His downfall this time comes where, looking at the budgets and being a man who's always interested in stretching fiscal resources as far as possible, he says that, look, well, we have this amount of budget for education. Let's try to get double the number of people to go to school. Okay, so with half we get double the number of people who go to school, and so for the half day, they essentially do some kind of job, and of course it's a hereditary occupation, right? So that is seen as reifying the caste system, and the Dravidian movement, led by Periyar, brings down the government, which, the rival of Rajgopalachari in the Congress, Kamaraj, is all too happy to support that, and then he kind of comes back and establishes his own dominance in the Congress, which of course leads to him becoming the kingmaker of politics, who then appoints Indira Gandhi as prime minister, and so on and so forth. So by the 50s, Rajgopalachari is now twice dismissed. Okay, he has been a minister without portfolio, a governor general, and a sort of 6-month home minister. And so for a guy who thought that he was going to be Gandhi's successor, this is a pretty raw deal. And he's he's obviously a publishing phenomenon. He's written over 50 to 60 books. He's published, all across Tamil and in English. Many of you may have read his Ramayana Mahabharata, which are published by the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. And, he's revered in various circles. But he finds enough energy to make a last stand, right? And he kind of reinvents himself as an economic affairs commentator, and then strings together through the sort of great force of his personality and with well-wishers, colleagues, etc., influence of the printing, the print public sphere, the nationalist print sphere. His son-in-law is the editor of Hindustan Times, Devdas Gandhi. His great editor of his Prohibition Journal is Kalki Krishnamurti, who edits Kalki, who's author of Ponniyin Selvan 1 and 2, which you may have seen. And so that allows him to amplify and really develop some kind of political capital.
He was fluent in Sanskrit, Tamil, English, of course, and so he was fluent enough to write in Kalki, in the Hindustan Times, and Swarajya, which, by the way, some of you will know has been reborn from the current right. So let's move on to Minu Masani or K. Munshi. By the way, Aditya was talking a fair bit about the on-again, off-again intersections between the precursor to the Bharatiya Janasangh and the Swatantra Party. So K.M. Munshi is one such intersection. The Rajaji's interactions with the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan is another set of interactions. So while they were they politically occupied slightly different spaces, there were also points of crossover between several of them. So maybe Munshi you can start with, and then we can go to Minu Masani.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who was cut from quite a different
very
cloth.
different cloth. Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think this question of how exactly opposition should come together is one that even Lodwala faces, in that he is somebody who reads the first manifesto written for the Bharatiya Janasangh, right? But then later starts to kind of split with them because he believes that they're too irrationally attached to a glorified past, and they don't really adequately critique the evils of the caste system. Right? So somebody like K.M. Munshi, right, who founds Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, is also publishing various anti-communist texts. Right? He is publishing. He has this particular idea about non-compulsion by government, and religion should be the orienting force that even guides your economic activity, etc. But he doesn't have. I would argue that he doesn't have a particularly well-developed economic ideology, right? He has some experience as food minister and this sort of thing, and he hosts these symposia on the welfare state at the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. His journal is plugged into this cluster of journals with Indian Libertarian and others. But he is somebody who is unambiguously a majoritarian in terms of his nationalist politics, right? He's very influential with the destruction of the mosque at Somnath and the reconstruction of the Somnath temple. But he's also, Munshi is a little hard to pin down. He's also the kind of, in some sense, the father of fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution, right? So there are certain kinds of ambiguity there, but he also sits in the first meeting of the VHP in 1964. Compared to him, you have a figure like who could not be more anglicized and I would argue less interested in religion, who is the Parsi Minu Masani, who is unabashedly pro-American, liberal. He writes these beautiful children's books, starting with Our India, which is more of a socialist track, but like many of these people, he kind of moves to the right. Illustrates the Bombay Plan, writes a book called Our Growing Human Family.
Illustrates the Bombay Plan.
He authors an illustrated version of the Bombay Plan.
And for those of you who don't know, the Bombay Plan is a wonderful testament to socialism, despite it being written almost entirely by industrialists.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's in World War II, when the nationalist leaders are in jail, a bunch of capitalists are sort of interested in what is the future direction the nation will take. And so they have Masani kind of illustrate that because he's, write an illustrated version of it because he's good at writing children's books. So Masani is a kind of cold warrior. He's part of what's called this anti-communist liberal international. He hangs out with, folks at the Yacht Club in Bombay. He's always in London. He's one of those sorts of people who has very little interest for this kind of Hindu society issue, right? He's a liberal in a classic sense, in the sense that he's for a uniform civil code. He doesn't believe in kind of special protections for minorities. So in that sense, he's different from certain kinds of Indian liberals, right? And he is somebody who is unabashedly for kind of free trade, not just domestically, but unlike many of the other Swatantra people, he's also thought through free trade globally as something that is extremely desirable for the country.
Terrific. So I'll leave you guys to think a lot about these kind of characters. There are a few more. We won't get into them all today. But there are a bunch of these secondary characters who have had a significant role to play, and many of us don't know enough about all of them. So I would encourage you to read about it. And now I'm going to go a little bit, only because this book really does deserve it. So going to go a little bit into the making of the book itself. And absolutely. I'll just open with this following observation that if you look at any single page, and Abhijit is just doing that, approximately 30% of the page is footnotes. Yeah. So the beauty of it, for those of you who care, is you can go down those rabbit holes at your own speed and through your own methods to figure out what the heck they are, right? So, and I was pleased, and so was he pleased to figure out I was one of those rabbit holes. I didn't know myself. But there are many, many rabbit holes that you can go down and explore and figure out what all of this is all about. So tell us, how you went about researching this book. It's extraordinarily well researched, and I would, for those of you who are into sort of the rigor of stating an observation, I think this is a case study in how to do it. So tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for those very, very kind remarks. I would say that part of the motivation of having extensive footnotes and this sort of thing is because, and this is my kind of polemical view, is that post-colonial history, as Ramachandra Guha likes to say, is a rather undeveloped field, and it is regarded in the academy often with sort of stepmotherly treatment. And the reason is because for the colonial era, you have these wonderful records in the India office and the British Library, which people can kind of sit at, and like laddus, they come and put stuff for you and you can kind of devour them, right? With post-colonial history, it's more difficult because a number of the file transfers that were supposed to have taken place from the ministries never happened, okay? And as a result of that, that makes things difficult to do, but it also presents an opportunity for us to be a little more creative about the kinds of sources that we use, right? And one of the things that I have been very fortunate is that the Center for Civil Society in New Delhi, right, digitized a number of publications of the Indian libertarians, of the Forum of Free Enterprise, writings of people like Rajgopalachari, collected writings of an economist like B.R. Shenoy, and were very generous in sharing those materials with me. So that's one thing, was published print materials that exist in a number of India's libraries and universities. If I may make another polemical point, a lot of these are in disrepair. So the state libraries and such are being digitized, but there are, for example, the working class library of Shabana Azmi's father, Kaifi Azmi in Bombay, that are in disrepair and don't have proper aims of proper kind of maintenance. And so it requires us, one, to discover them and then to kind of try to preserve them as well. And I'm hoping that through some of the footnotes here and this sort of thing, some of that awareness can be raised. But we do have a wealth of resources from India's post-colonial history that are printed, that are private papers. So a figure like Rajgopalachari, the second largest collection, or the third largest collection after Gandhi and Nehru in the Nehru Memorial Library in New Delhi. Figure like K. Munshi, again, huge collection of writings. So you have those official archives, private papers of people who had been nationalist leaders. You have print culture, right? Newspapers, magazines, many of which have been kind of forgotten or into disrepair. And then they're kind of, yeah.
Yeah. One of the interesting little subsections in the book is about publications that are not mainstream publications. I don't know, you can talk for a second about that and then return back to your idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of these publications, this connected cluster of journals and associations where the discourse of free economy is born. These are in the pages of magazines that a lot of people would not know existed in India. There was something called Thought. There was something called Mice India, which was edited by a man called Philip Spratt, who used to live in Bangalore. And one of the characters of Ramachandra Guha's Rebels Against the Raj. There is another figure who runs something called the Society for Defense of Freedom in Asia. Right? There are a magazine called The Indian Rationalist, run by a man who says that he espouses libertarianism, who founded the self-respect movement with Periyar. Right? So there are all kinds of things that are taking place while India is slowly growing more literate, while the number of publications that are being circulated increases, etc., etc. And so one of the opportunities was to discover these and really understand that you have not just a left intellectual culture, but you also have an anti-communist intellectual culture that is, maybe less well known, but it is far from not being unsubstantial at this period of time. And yeah, of course, so in addition to that, I have kind of scraps and fragments from everywhere, right? So I have gramophone recordings from a rural gramophone library in Kerala of the Swatantra Party from the 1962 and 1967. Sunny's Gramophone Recording Museum. If anybody wants to go, Plasanal, Kerala. Similarly, I have kind of fragments from archives in Germany that economists like Röpke are writing to Shenoy. You have fragments in the of early libertarian journals in the papers of an anarchist, which is in New Hampshire, and in the University of Florida library. So if you search far and wide. And thankfully, we live in a moment where the internet has got every day more and more new things. You can kind of help piece together some of these forgotten stories and bring alive some of the connections that have been forgotten over time.
Did you actually do interviews as well?
Yeah, I did a few interviews. So I suppose, as a somewhat purist, old-fashioned historian, I find that when you do certain kinds of interviews, you can become unduly influenced by the person that you're interviewing. But I would say that there were a few that I found particularly valuable. The first was to interview the author of the book, The Swatantra Party and Indian Conservatism, that came out in 1967, which, apart from mine and a book by a historian in Hyderabad, or political scientist in Hyderabad, are the only two books on the Swatantra Party. And he actually went and met the leaders of the Swatantra Party and actually spent time with them. Some people thought he was a CIA agent. He had wonderful stories about how, for example, Pilu Modi was so bad at going to, dealing with rural Gujarat, he found it so uncomfortable that when he had to give a speech there, he brought a porta potty with him, so that he wasn't happy with the rural restrooms. Similarly, Sen gave me told me about how he went to a fundraiser in the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, but actually they had a lot of trouble getting donations because big business was scared of going against the Congress. So that provides a certain kind of texture. I was also able to interview H.V. Hande, who runs a hospital in Chennai, who had been a member of the Swatantra Party, is now a member of the BJP, and had been health minister of Tamil Nadu. So he was able to tell me about how what it felt like to win an election in 1964 in Park Street constituency, a Parktown constituency, and be in opposition with the leader or the person who founded the Dinatandi newspaper, and the kinds of interactions that they had. So there was a great excitement about being a part of this new organization, and that helped give certain kind of texture. But again, I didn't want to get too carried away either with my positive or negative impressions of the strong personalities that I was interviewing.
So in the PhD history world of today, the interviewing method is...
I think it really depends. I mean, I think there's a very productive brand of work that is history and anthropology. And I think for that, those methods kind of cross-fertilize a bit better. I suppose I'm just a bit old-fashioned because...
Because in a way, isn't the written word of yesterday subject to the very same biases and impressions that you might have today?
Right. So in a sense, that is the postmodern critique of a lot of the archival scholarship, which is that you have to be attentive to the conditions of production, and that the archive has got many omissions, elisions, and silences of its own. Right. I mean, after 11 years, I can still tell you very little about Kusum Lodwala, which is a constant. I don't have a single picture of her, right? Whereas Ranchod Das Lodwala, I can bring out for you. So yes, those are certainly concerns, and I think there are problems with the production of the source. But I also feel that by virtue of the fact that that is an inanimate text and it's standing there, it's less of a two-way relationship in a manner of speaking. Because you're not dealing with the live subject.
Okay. I'm going to get you to start thinking about your questions. I'm going to end the formal conversation with this last question. So tell us what you're working on and why.
So I'm now working on two things. Three things, but I'll primarily the first is a short piece based actually doing some research in Bangalore on the history of eucalyptus planting in India. And sort of trying to think through, my great question that kind of motivates my research is how do we better understand, right, India's economic development and the kind of extension of universal franchise after 47, right? And there are various aspects of that. It's a very broad-pitched question. And one way is trying to understand different projects of development and the ways in which they have various kinds of consequences, right? There are sort of political motivations for them. Eucalyptus planting is something that is thought to be really a magic bullet to deal with the problems of development because it provides you with pulp, it grows quickly, it can be used for construction, all kinds of things without sufficient attention to the water requirements of eucalyptus, right? So I'm looking at that and looking at how it's embedded in various kinds of...
Well, I'll add one thing, since my wife is a birder.
Yes.
it dramatically decreases the biodiversity of the location it is in. I mean, in addition to the water.
Exactly, and that's something that we're at risk of with the new Forest Act as well, given the kind of reforestation schemes that are being planned with with eminent domain laws that are being reformed to essentially introduce monoculture of trees as carbon sinks. So you can see a way in which this is impacts the present. And now various high courts have banned, including, I believe, Karnataka High Court has banned the planting of eucalyptus. So I want to study that. And the second thing, again, thinking through the real, I think, as somewhere a historian has written, any truly materialist account of history should start with resources, right? So I'm looking at the history of road building and transportation in modern India through 4 sites: the Grand Trunk Road, the Great Eastern Road from Surat to Calcutta, the Maheva Village Road in Etawah district in Uttar Pradesh, which is an American community development Cold War type village road. Most of India's roads, 70 to 80%, are village roads, right? And then finally the Anna flyover in Chennai, the first flyover in the city that will become India's automobile hub, and it's a centerpiece of the first DMK government's development I suppose, development enterprise. And so that's broadly what I'm working on and trying to think through the linked economic and environmental history of this and how federalism and democratic demands shape road building in post-colonial India.
So for those who think we have run out of subjects to research, you can just hear the kind of topics that Aditya is working on. End with this thing. Tell us a little story about how you got to the eucalyptus idea. And this is really sort of a human idea of serendipity, which might help you no matter whether you're a PhD or not. So,
so I work in Australia now, and I moved there in November 2018, and I had a very kind colleague who figured out that I didn't know anybody in Canberra and said, why don't you come to my place for Christmas dinner? And so I did, and I met his very charming wife, and she said, oh, your family hails from the Indian subcontinent. My father's sort of deathbed regret was that he encouraged so much eucalyptus planting in India as the chief of the botanical gardens and later a kind of consultant forester. And so I said, wow, that sounds really interesting. I mean, did your father leave any papers? Now, this is not necessarily a polite question to ask somebody, but I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity for research. And sure enough, he had papers somewhere, but actually there was a more prominent forester who established the chair of botany at my university, the Australian National University, who went all over India in the 50s and 60s to advise on eucalyptus planting. And in fact, there is a particular species of eucalyptus that's actually named after him.
So not only your significant other, but lots of interesting things might emerge from very serendipitous meetings. So with that, I'm going to turn it to the audience to ask questions and maybe draw some parallels or differences from where we are today. Please, 1 second, you'll get the mic. So the only reason to use the mic is that we are recording. So
sure, of course. Am I audible?
It'll be helpful if you just say an introduction.
Yeah, hi, my name is Navneethan. I got the book a few months ago. I saw it on Marginal Revolution.
Oh, thank you.
It sounded interesting. I started reading it on the way over here, so I've only read the first chapter or so forgive me if this is mentioned later. One thing that strikes me that's interesting about the Swatantra Party's victories, even though it's an opposition and a minority, what would really have become if it became the majority, right? I mean, then it becomes the state that it's opposed to in the first place, right? I mean, wouldn't that be a kind of strange position for an anti-statist? It's like the libertarians becoming the government or the anarchists taking over the government. So that's one question that I have. The other is who right now, if anyone, represents that kind of maybe libertarian ideal in India, if there is anyone like that.
Sure.
His first question is relevant this week because Javier Milei has taken over in Argentina.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for. So I think I think Narayan raised this issue earlier, right? With the question of was Swatantra not adequately ambitious in a different way, and by pitching themselves as the opposition. And I think for example, the experiment in Orissa, which was very short-lived. So it's very difficult to draw many conclusions from that because it really kind of collapses in 2 years. What would Swatantra have done? I don't know. But what I would venture to say would be that, again, like in what you could say is maybe drawing some parallels to what Rajgopalachari did when he was in office, right? Running a frugal administration, balancing budgets, cutting taxes, right? Reducing, eliminating controls which actually decrease the prices of food, right? Because there's a lot of hoarding and this sort of thing. So I think you could have seen certain kinds of things in that respect. Now, there's also another question of whether the constituency for free economy was too small that you have to do certain kind of allegiances with other kinds of conservatives, right? Who are religious or social conservatives. And then would that have been a very different kind of hydra-headed monster, right? So that we don't know. That I think is up for question. And your second question was, sorry? Yeah. 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 So I think in terms of informal, right? Informally, I think in many ways, the Center for Civil Society tries to kind of carry on some of the ideas of Swatantra. But I would say that, when I wrote an op-ed about the INDIA coalition and certain lessons that might be learned in opposition from Swatantra, one person who responded to that op-ed and retweeted it was Shashi Tharoor, who said that he was actually a member of the Swatantra Party when he was a student in college. And that he believes their principles to be very sound for today. So if we think that after liberalization, the center of gravity has shifted in a certain sense, again, I don't know what Swatantra would make of the subsidy raj that we have across the political spectrum in today's India. They might see it as wasteful and whatnot. They may not, the deficits across the political spectrum. But I think that there are people who are kind of sympathetic to that line. Another person is, again, on the birthday of Rajgopalachari, who was quite effusive in his support for his ideas and not, was Jairam Ramesh.
So I might just add to your point that the beauty of democratic parties when they're allowed to function well is they tend to be wide tents. So the Congress itself, which included, of course, at moments in time, Rajgopalachari and others, was always a very wide tent. It had D.P. Dhar on one side and Manmohan Singh types on the other at, of course, different points in history. And they wait a moment in which they can surface their point of view. That either comes out of catastrophe, 1991, or comes out of a shake, an electoral shake. So you lose a state or you win a state, and then you're able to move either direction. So, by the way, if you read Ezra Vogel's brilliant biography of Deng Xiaoping, you will see that even a monolithic party like the Chinese Communist Party is an extremely wide tent. And large heterogeneous societies need to be governed pretty much on the spectrum from center right to center left. And the big question that's upon us today is, can it truly be governed from extreme left or extreme right? And it's an open question whether large heterogeneous societies will, over time, be prosperous and stable and peaceful. And one live experiment at a far extreme is this Javier Milei in Argentina. We've already seen versions of it with Jair Bolsonaro and Trump and famously, of course, Putin, but that's a different model. It's not really democratic. Sorry, please go ahead. We'll go one and then 1, 2, 3.
Sir, one second.
I didn't ask a question, he did.
Sir, 1 second. Can we just go in order? We'll give you the mic.
Yeah. So,
Good evening. My name is Professor Aparna Umar Rahman. I was a researcher in Singapore at the National University of Singapore, and also now I'm a faculty at IISc. I'm a lawyer by education, and my PhD is interdisciplinary. I just wanted to, there are two things. First of all, that even history repeats itself. It's not like India as a system is really one system or one structure, because even today there are certain big businesses, there is a certain gap, there are certain tendencies or patterns that tend to repeat over time. That's just biological. See, I teach law and environment and legal science. There's a lot of common patterns that manifest themselves. And so there is I mean to say it all depends on, because the system works in such a way. There's obviously going to be some people who will, sort of have a distributive effect on others and who will do well, better, And my other thing is there's so much migration. Half of Tamil Nadu is sitting in California or America. Half of Kerala is in Gulf. Half of Punjab is in Canada. So these migrations have now had a tendency to go abroad. That kind of effect was not there then. Just the level of open...
Could I get you to ask a question
so
now?
my question is that how do you, despite the fact that we don't have those kind of people, because there's not one, it's so open that unless we have a rebirth of someone like Rajagopalachari, the credibility and that kind of genius again manifesting itself, how is that even going to now translate into anything concrete? As in, how is anybody going to revive this? Who's going to take the risk really in India? It's not a society where, people want to just put themselves out.
Yeah, so I think that, when I kind of discuss the revivalist strand, it isn't about assessing whether or not, what exactly those prospects would be. But having said that, I think it's significant. You mentioned some of these emigre communities, right? Let's look at Tamil Brahmins, Kammas, Reddis, Patidars. These are the communities I talk about in the book. And if you were to look in the United States, these are overwhelmingly represented in what Devesh Kapoor and his co-authors call the other 1%, which are the most prosperous minority community, most prosperous ethnic community in America, right? So you have that, and so some, you can put it in the terms of Albert Hirschman, you can say that some exited, right, and some have kind of exhibited loyalty to the system, and some have kind of exhibited voice and joined opposition. At the same time, right, you have, since that time, you have economic growth that has benefited certain sections of the population that are not necessarily those communities, but have moved into, middle class is a very fraught term, which I go into that in the book, but have moved, but I would say that those are possible constituencies who have now been mobilized or appealed to by other kinds of rhetoric, right? So the wager or the hope is that perhaps, if you were to offer something like a Swatantra party, that those communities, of which there are much more, right? Because the other thing is you have population growth from then. So you have a much larger population, even if you have selective out-migration. So there is a possibility that you would have constituencies for that, but I'm not, I wouldn't be able to tell you because I'm not the CSDS Lokniti guy or the Trivedi Center for Political Data person or the census expert. I'm just a historian of ideas. So
Hi, my name is Daniel. I work as an entrepreneur. I deal with artificial intelligence and cloud computing services. My question to you is, you say history is relevant to us if it provides us with solutions for today and for the future. So in our current paradigm that we are in, we have the left, which has failed miserably, and we have the neoliberal right, which has also failed and is showing its true colors. So we have to have an alternative in this particular paradigm. The thing about today's paradigm is that we have post-truth society where political jingoism plays a huge role in how the electoral votes. Now, with libertarian being a very intellectual system which requires you to think hard, what do you think is the relevance, and how can these value system, this political thought and values and ideologies be brought out and disseminated to a large common public?
Yeah. So should I just take that?
Yeah, please.
So no, thank you for that question. So I think with the issue of neoliberal, the question is like, how do you define it, right? And actually elsewhere I've read, if you have a kind of strict definition of neoliberal, then it has fairly limited policy influence on India, and we're actually quite far away from what some of those people who espouse neoliberalism would say that we have. So, for example, you have a number of people who are very hopeful about post 2014 about the kinds of activities that will be pursued, and actually say, look, this is really not creating the conditions for business that we wanted. So I think that terminology kind of has to be parsed a little bit. Now, to your point about what can we take from this for today, right? I would say that there are a couple of things. I would say that first is we've seen increasing amount of centralization of power, economic power in this country over the last decade or so. And I think whereas the trend, right, from the 50s with the finance commissions was decentralization in a manner of speaking, right? And of course, you can debate about what happens during the Indira years and all of that. But I think that is something that Swatantra was quite keen on, decentralized development. And I think that's something that's worth holding on to. The other point is an attention to rural India. Now, of course, some of that was Swatantras, Maharajas, and all of that. But you also had figures like Rajgopalachari who are not, cannot be reduced to that. And I think and if you look at the Charotar Patidars, one of their major gripes was that there is an urban bias in resource distribution. Now, if you were to read Harish Damodaran's, fantastic work in his weekly columns on what's going on in rural India, or the work of economists like Jean Drèze, you can see that resonates deeply into the present, right? And that there is continue to be a neglect of rural India, no matter the number of roads that are being built and this sort of thing. So I think those are two things from Swatantra that we can kind of take away. And the third is, of course, linguistic diversity. Right. Swatantra is involved in, first of all, they believe that, at least the Indian libertarians believe that English should be the lingua franca for India, because they believe Indian languages to be, ridden with their caste vocabularies. But more practically, they are interested in, they bitterly oppose the one nation, one language kind of idea. And that actually forms one of the kind of ideological points of contact between the Swatantra and the DMK.
Please go ahead.
So thanks a lot for writing the book, first off, because there was obviously a dearth of literature on Swatantra or any of the figures. But I had this question, and I perhaps touched upon this in our last interaction, that the underpinning of this book in general is to challenge the assumption of neoliberalism as anti-democratic, which it does extremely well throughout the book, except as we discussed in the first chapter, I felt. And in first chapter, I felt that you seem to uncritically accept a lot of Nehruvian precepts. And I just cite some examples. The one is India's new world-class capital goods producing firms. And I think that you took from Frankel's book on India's political economy. The other one was the planning process helped put the country on a path to growth and leave colonial economic stagnation behind, right? And just as a counter in terms of facts, penicillin in India sold at 1150% higher than global prices. Fridges 150% higher, and all the capital goods. The list goes on, right?
Could you just synthesize the question, if you don't mind?
And I mean, it's later in the book you do touch upon Shenoy's hypothesis that consumption did not really increase at all. From 1951 to 1967, there was absolutely almost no increase in consumption numbers. So. What was the reason beyond not touching upon it in like the first chapter?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things. I mean, I think my definition of capital goods and consumer goods is different from yours. I don't think of refrigerators as capital goods. I think of, like steel plants are producing capital goods. And I think that actually there's a fair amount of literature, right, that would substantiate the hypothesis that India actually does, end up, being able to produce heavy industrial output with this protection. Now, whether or not those steel plants are as good as the steel plants in Japan is a different question, right? And there is a long question of whether or not, tariffs and protections, going back to Frederick List, actually help infant industries develop. There are different views on that. Now, on the question of colonial economic stagnation, if you look at kind of Bishnupriya Gupta's work on the Indian economy, right? The fact of the matter is that you move from 100 years of colonial economic degrowth to positive economic growth. Now, the counterfactual of whether if you had unleashed free markets in 1947, whether or not that would have happened is a different one. But the point that I'm trying to establish in that chapter, which I think I have, is that you do move from 0 to 3%, or what was, which was kind of knocked by Raj Krishna as the Hindu rate of growth, or whatever it is, right? And that is a significant thing. Now, it wasn't 8, it wasn't, we're not Singapore, all of that is fair. But thinking about historical change over time, this is the development. And some people, right, these are not my arguments, but some people would argue that this allows you to have the basis, right, that you can then later on pursue a different kind of political economy. Because otherwise, the alternative when what happens to some is that they become plantation economies, right? They continue to be agriculture producing, like Jamaica or whatever, and they are, as your dependency theorists would have it, they are kind of at the mercy of what happens to agricultural prices. So that is another kind of take. But my specific point is to basically try to give you a sense of what happens in the Nehruvian, and capital goods, as I'm defining them, is different from what I submit. I completely agree with you that the fact that the Morris Oxford is being produced as the ambassador from 1956 to 2014, and that your family is storing something in a Godrej until the late 1990s, perhaps even today, that is not exactly a win for consumer surplus or consumer goods. Absolutely. And that relates to the protections that are given to the Indian capitalist class, which kind of prevent them from innovating. Yeah.
Good evening, guys. Thank you so much for the book and for the session. My question was about the Swatantra Party. Right? One of the things they did was they made economic discourse sort of central to electoral politics in a way that it hadn't really been in India, that was largely based or largely looked to identity assertions. Could you speak to how they managed that?
So I wouldn't say that it's only based on, first of all, I wouldn't say it's only the Swatantra Party, and I wouldn't say that, so there is unitary nationalism of, a Gandhian variety, which I don't think is just about identity and religion. Of course, that's a part of it. But if you look at kind of Nehruvian thought, for example, there is something there that is about, the temples of modernity and planning it sort of secularized also. What I am trying to say is that political thought of the, as discussed by the Swatantra Party, rather than thinking of economics as a scientific phenomenon, that we hire the experts, they build the input-output tables, they draw up the plans, and they push those out. The idea is to kind of go back a step and to say, well, no, this should be something that ordinary people who are feeling the pinch of it should be able to discuss and debate and protest. Now, the communists are doing that in a different way, but I think the extent to which there is a critique, right, of the plans on their own terms, right, and not in terms of class terms, which is what's being done by the communists, right? I think that is significant. The other thing is about the way in which, and again, this also answers your question about what can we take from the Swatantra Party today, is the kind of role that they see themselves as providing as peer educators. So one of the things that happens is that Kalki magazine runs these 15-part series on political economy or on the different strands of governments. And Kalki is a culture magazine, okay? I mean, it produces these stories like Ponniyin Selvan or whatever in serialized form, all of that. But there is a belief and understanding that this stuff is important. And so there is a kind of translation that takes place as well. And I think that that's something that, one of the reviews of this book that came, so this was a slightly different time in educational, in politics, where, understanding that you have a young democracy, the idea that you need to educate, if slightly paternalist in tone, it also at some level raises the political discourse, right? Because it's not about, oh, your father was corrupt, or, oh, we've done, this amount of good, and we're on the word, whatever, the king of all the democracies, all of that. It was more about, if you're running this kind of a deficit, can you really get to this kind of a growth rate, right?
But just to add to that, just 1 second, to add to that, from the politics side of this, you can decide whether the debate between Huntington and Fukuyama is a cyclical one, or we are permanently back to the state of Huntington, right? And Fukuyama was Huntington's student when that famous debate took place. So for those of you who don't know, please look up that debate. But the essential notion Huntington says is that the era of ideology is over, and we will go back to our tribal identities as the basis of our conflict and our political identities. So as you can see, for instance, the very nature of the Ukrainian conflict, where Ukraine is called Little Rus, or the Hamas-Israeli conflict, or indeed a lot of what is being practiced in India today, we have gone back to an identity politics. Now, whether that is, and Trump in the US and everywhere in Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you can ask the question whether Huntington is right forever, or we are in a cyclical phase in which Huntington is right again.
Hello. Do you have any views on whether agricultural incomes in India should be taxed in some form or the other, either through some land revenue tax, or because today the whole system is skewed towards non-agriculturals bearing the entire burden of direct taxes. Even M.S. Swaminathan has gone to the extent of saying that agriculture should not be taxed. What is your view on this?
I'm a historian, not an economist, but that's a bit of a cop-out. So here's what I would say. I think that the question of agricultural incomes, there's also a point about how you would levy the taxes, right? Because you have, sorry? Land tax, yeah. So I mean, I am broadly sympathetic to something like that, because I think that is the failure of land reform, right, in the rural areas is essentially one of the greatest reasons why we continue to have so much of trouble in the rural economy. And so I think that would be a way. It is not just a question of the land tax, but it's a question of what exactly you would do having collected that tax. For the rural areas. But yes, I suppose if you were to have them in tandem, that's something that might be a valuable thing to do.
Yeah, I can be much more vociferous about this wearing my Takshashila hat. Absolutely, I think you should. At least the time has now come for us to, and start with electricity even before land tax, to charge the farmer for the electricity. And now the mechanisms exist that if you need targeted subsidies, you can actually wire back the subsidy, exactly the way you do for gas, right, cooking gas. So you can potentially tax them, and for those who deserve a helping hand of some sort, you can actually give them a direct subsidy rather than an indirect subsidy. The problem with the indirect subsidy is it distorts prices, exactly in the same way that cooking gas thing happened, which is if you have a universal subsidy, then there's no price by definition. Or it's a subsidized price which distorts the market supply and demand function. Whereas if you have a price and then you kick back money in whatever way for the people who deserve it, then the market functions for those who need to have it function. So I think the time has come. India is not a poor country anymore. You heard it here first. And therefore, it is important that we begin to tax everything that deserves to be taxed. But our challenge is we need to keep it flat, simple, and constant. That we are not able to do. We keep it not flat, not simple, and inconstant. That makes it a harassment. All taxes, whether it is GST, whether it is income tax, whether it is retroactive tax, it is the harassment of tax that is creating the confusions that it does. So if you can keep it flat, constant, and consistent, then we're in good shape. That would be. I'm just adding to the historian since he won't look into the future. Yeah, well, we'll take it offline, but.
Hi, I'm Pratyush. I'm trying to discover conversation inside economics, and I find your book and your talk quite illuminating in the whole libertarian conversation that has been happening before 91. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. So my question was the moral plank on which the whole conversation started, which was on the caste and labor and gender, and how the status quo was taken up by Rajagopalachari, and then there was also the free market aspect. So there was, the first question is, why is there no reconciling between these two ideas? They can be reconciled together. And as India was quite in a state where the labor condition was pretty bad, and the whole hierarchy was there, the caste hierarchy in terms of even the gender hierarchy, and it was existing. So why was why are these two moral planks not reconcilable, and why was it that the whole idea wasn't espoused in such a way? Yeah.
I'm not sure I quite understood your question. So you're asking whether there is some kind of nexus between the entrenchment of caste and like free markets, or what are you trying?
I just want to understand of the ontological perspective from which the whole movement came about, and in this perspective you had mentioned earlier in the beginning that there was a bit of status quo on the caste. That's why you had DMK come in power. And I also went through the preface, and there was this status quo on the gender as well, which you had mentioned.
Sure.
And on the labor as well, the commentary was about that. And my question here was that now the whole anti-bureaucracy and the anti-statism that the whole skepticism that you mentioned. That's a fair commentary here. And the point I'm making is, why can't there be a reconciliation between these two? Then you would have I would say, there would be more chance for an effective opposition.
Absolutely. And I think that, I think when we to look at the past of the Swatantra Party, it's worth studying both its successes and failures. There are certain opportunities. In a manner of speaking, free economy could have been pitched. I mean, again, as a historian, this is me speaking as a sort of citizen rather than as a historian who looks at the past, because there's only so much Monday morning quarterbacking you can do after the Sunday night football game, right? But there are, if we're looking at this as a usable past rather than the past, right? What are certain kinds of things that you could think about? Well, the fact that in all of your party literature, the person is a man, right? The fact that you could make more appeals to to minorities and women. All of these things, I think, can definitely be reconciled to visions of a free economy. And of course, if you take the very radical, right, even the Marxist theoretician would argue that if you take the very radical capitalist approach, it should, right, whether or not it does is a different question, it should abolish number of these hierarchies as well. Right?
Okay, on that note, we're going to call it a night. So thank you very much for attending. And Aditya is here to sign some books if you like. And